Should smartphones be banned in schools? Well, UNESCO says they should, claiming they're detrimental to learning and even enable bullying. But how many agree a ban is necessary? And how easy would it be to implement? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the smartphone in school. Well, many argue technology has revolutionized education, bringing instant access to endless amounts of information with just a tap or a click. But smartphones also provide access to social media and answers that facilitate cheating. So managing technology in schools, especially smartphones, has become a global debate. On one side, phones can bring learning to life by creating personalized content for every student. They also allow parents to reach their kids during school hours. But on the other side, they're proving a major distraction to learning. So much so that UNESCO is recommending smartphones be banned from schools across the board. Here's a look.
UNESCO's latest education report calls on countries to consider the use of technology in schools. The report highlights that the digital revolution opens up huge opportunities, but says it should not be detrimental to the well-being of teachers and children, and that countries should maintain a human-centered vision.
No screen will ever replace a teacher. Learning means listening, trusting, creating connections. Everything else is a tool, and tools can be useful and effective, but they can do nothing without the fundamental relationship between teacher and student.
The report has also recommended a ban on smartphones in schools to tackle classroom disruption and improve learning. It says the evidence shows that excessive use of mobiles reduces educational performance. It also takes a toll on students' mental health as children become more vulnerable to cyberbullying. Almost a quarter of countries are already introducing a ban. The Netherlands joined those countries last month, with their ban coming into effect at the start of next year.
Het is gewoon heel belangrijk om...
It is just really important to have an environment during the lessons where there is just all the attention for the teaching, for the teacher. And cell phones are just very disruptive.
But students don't like the idea. They're aware of the downsides, but want their phones for connectivity in emergency situations.
I get a bit anxious because, there's so much happening on your phone, like social media and things like that. So I get a bit anxious and I'm not even able to focus sometimes because I'm thinking what's happening, who's texting me, stuff like that.
If there's an emergency call that I get or something, I would have to pick it up. They'd have to respect that I would have to pick it up. So that would be the only reason.
I don't really know if a ban is really gonna be able to do anything more than they've already tried.
Increasing emphasis on the use of technology in education also widens existing inequalities. Online resources are heavily weighted in favor of Western countries. Learning rapidly shifted online during the COVID-19 pandemic, and at least 500 million young people dropped out because of it. And all of that aside, many schools lack the most basic amenities. The report says 25% of the world's primary schools have no electricity.
This makes us think about the context of the responses, especially on unequal regions such as ours. How we can reach rural or faraway sectors with the same capacity of connection, and not just with access to a device, but also with an internet connection.
The balance of digital and traditional tools in education is a delicate one. Educators and administrators need to consider many areas like equity, data privacy, access, and the emotional well-being of students and teachers to successfully strike that balance.
Well, let's get more now on how UNESCO reached the conclusion to ban smartphones. And joining me from Paris is Kate Redman. She's a senior project officer at UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report. Thanks so much for being with us. Let's start broad and get to the main conclusion here, that phones in the classroom have, one, reduced educational performance, and then two, that excessive screen time has had a negative effect on even children's emotional stability. I mean, how were these things, first of all, how were they measured? And are the issues the same, really, across the board in wealthy as well as developing countries?
So the evidence is one of many pieces of evidence in the new annual Global Education Monitoring Report produced by UNESCO. It looks at every single country around the world on the theme of the moment and looks at that theme, which for this year is technology, and its relation in respect to which those countries are managing to achieve good or slow progress in education. And what we found with technology is that in many instances, it's engaging students, it's giving access to students to education that they might not have had before. It's enabling teachers to access many resources. But on the other hand, there is a flip side where it may be leaving many students out and if used incorrectly or inappropriately can be a distraction to learning. And that was the conclusion that we found when we were looking at mobile phones. The evidence that's there on mobile phones is only coming from high-income countries, so there is no evidence on this issue in low-income countries at the minute. But that's actually something that you find when you're looking at evidence on technology and education globally, is that most of it is coming from high-income countries. There is a lack of evidence on the extent to which technology can improve learning. And what evidence there might be from developing countries and low income countries is small sort of snapshots. They may seem to be more positive, but that often you need to question who has commissioned that research.
Okay.
Is it, in fact, the company themselves that put the product in the school that's asked for that research to come out?
So, I mean, overall, though, you are asking for a more, as you called it, human-centered vision of education. That sounds good, but let me ask you if you think it's better now when the order for that and, to ban smartphones comes from above rather than from an individual teacher. I know you probably saw it too, one video that went viral of a teacher actually being attacked with pepper spray for confiscating the phone of a student in Nashville, I believe. So if it's school policy then, and it's coming from above, no teacher has to be the so-called bad guy.
I think that's right. Look, we spoke to teachers just as we were finishing this report to hear their views on this issue, and they're saying, look, actually, it's nice to have some form of policy or regulation in place because often the parents don't have the power to take smartphones out of their children's hands, and they hope that when their children come to school, they're coming into a learning environment and that things like smartphones or other forms of technology are not going to be there as a distraction for them. And when they leave their children at school, they know that their children are there to learn and that nothing else is getting in the way.
It's funny that you mentioned the parents that are grateful for having this kind of ban, when actually we've seen examples of parents who say, no, I want my child to have their smartphone on them so I can reach them at school. But when was that the case? I know we're quite a bit older than students today, but when was it the case that, parents should have the option to almost interrupt a child during their education during the day? If there was an emergency, you could always call the school itself. Has something in that realm changed?
Look, I think one thing that is quite important to say right now is in the language with which we're talking about the role that smartphones should or should not play in education, you need to understand that different countries are looking at this in different ways. So, for instance, in Singapore and Bangladesh, you're allowed to have a phone in your school, but you're not allowed to have it in your class. Or in France, for instance, there is a ban on smartphones in school, but teachers can bring them into their lessons if they think that that's going to help with what they're actually teaching that day. And also, children with disabilities are allowed to use phones as well because of the accessibility features. So I think, look, no one size fits all is going to work everywhere. I guess what the main message is of the report is that any use of technology, smartphone or other, it has to be appropriate, equitable, evidence-based, and sustainable.
Okay. Kate Redman, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of The
Thank you.
Newsmakers. Let's broaden out the discussion now, and joining me from Greystones, Ireland is Rachel Harper. She is the head teacher at St. Patrick's Primary School. And from Mexico City is the National Research Director at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. That's a nonprofit education think tank, Dr. Adam Tyner. Thanks both so much for being with me. Rachel, I will start with you because as a teacher, were you relieved to hear UNESCO's conclusion in this report?
Yes, I was, absolutely. Here in Greystones, we could certainly see an increase in anxiety levels in children in the primary years. And I suppose as principal of St. Patrick's here in Greystones, I reached out to the other principals and just to see if they could see something similar in their schools, and they certainly could. And that led us to start up a community-led wellbeing initiative called It Takes a Village. And within this, we're looking at different areas to promote children's well-being. And one of the areas we were looking at was the smartphones and the usage of smartphones. And we could see here in Ireland that they were creeping in at a very young age, even as young as 9. And we could see the consequences of this. And I suppose led us to come together as a group of 8 principals in the area to see if we could try and work with the parents to try and ask them voluntarily to sign up to a code to wait and to get a smartphone for their children until secondary when they're 12, 13 years of age. So we have been working on that as a town, and I was delighted then to hear UNESCO have come out with this report just confirming all of our thoughts around this area.
Right. You know, Adam, let me come to you. I'm a bit older than both of you, I'm sure, but still, you'll probably remember that, you know, teachers would punish us in school for passing notes during class because that was distracting, and you might only get 1 in an hour of class. I was shocked to find out that it would ever actually be okay to have your phone on in class while learning. There must have been something to it. So tell us, why was it beneficial for some to begin with?
Well, a lot of kids have their phones in class with them, whether or not the phones are technically banned or not. In the United States, where I'm based, according to federal statistics, about 3/4 of schools supposedly ban phones already. But the devil is in the details. And as the UNESCO report points out, it matters a lot how that's implemented, what kind of consequences there are for students. But a lot of students, if you look at surveys of students, you'll find that lots of students have their phones with them all day. And that is because of a combination of factors. A lot of parents like it if they can be in touch with their children during the school day. Obviously, kids like to have their phones because, like all of us, they're a little bit addicted to them. And so it really is something that just kind of evolved over time. They started taking their phones. Many parents want their kids to have a phone in school, and that's been an obstacle in many communities. But the research on this is pretty clear, I think. There's not a ton of research on it, and it's not the strongest research base, but the research that we have all indicates that banning phones in schools either has no effect, as one study showed, or as several other studies have shown, it does have a positive effect on student learning. That those effects on student learning are concentrated on students who are lower performing. So banning phones can help close achievement gaps potentially because those students are more affected. And it's also been, there's one study from Spain that came out last year that showed that there were reductions in bullying after banning phones in some regions of Spain. So I think that, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why this has evolved over time and why it's kind of difficult to pry that phone out of kids' hands when you have so many different people who may want them to have it for different reasons.
But yeah, let me come back to Rachel then, because one of the issues was that kids having access to their phones also gives them access, obviously, to the internet nonstop, and that has a lot of misinformation on it, especially where kids are searching around. Have you found that to be an issue, that kids are getting, you know, improper exposure to things that are online? I mean, it's even a problem for adults to be exposed to so much of what's on the internet. But to have kids have that at their disposal during the school day, is it a big problem?
Absolutely. Well, I suppose just to be clear, we never allowed phones in school, but certainly they were accessing their phones outside of school. And we would have said, at a click of a button, they can reach adult information far beyond their years. And it's a huge worry to parents, to teachers, to principals. As a parent recently said to me, you wouldn't let your child open the door to a stranger and leave them in there. And unfortunately, in a room full of strangers, by giving a child a phone and by just having access to it every moment, you don't know the content that your child is and the information that they're reaching. And that's a huge worry. We would have seen, 9-year-olds even with these phones and 10-year-olds. And just with things we would have noticed, they're a lot more body conscious, I suppose just even if there were any questions or queries or worries, we would have some children from Ukraine in our school who are doing brilliantly. But if you want to just look up about the war in Ukraine, at the click of a button, you can get into really adult content, scary content, And I suppose children looking to role models online that maybe aren't age appropriate, rather than their parents or their families or real people around them, So we just kind of found, look, it's just they're not emotionally ready at the primary level, we feel, to access information.
Okay. The fact that the rights of teachers themselves could be involved. We've seen a lot of videos also go viral of kids taping their teachers in class. Some are funny, some less funny, and you could understand why teachers would be uncomfortable knowing that there's pretty much always a camera potentially on them while they're trying to focus on teaching their class. How much of a hindrance is that for the rights of teachers?
I think that it's very important. How could you possibly, as a teacher, compete with the technology that these corporations have, spent untold money on? They hire armies of psychologists and data miners and, all these people to engineer these apps that are engaging and that get us, you could say, addicted to them. And for a teacher in that classroom, whether it is a room full of distracted students who are looking down at their phone every few seconds or every few minutes, or whether it's concerns about their privacy, I think this is just a nightmare for teachers in the places where this isn't regulated well.
Right. Then if it is regulated well, you brought this up, and we need to speak further about it in particular. How do you actually enforce this ban? We've heard about a number of schools that have said, oh, we've banned cell phones in the classroom in particular, but students still sneak them in. But we know, for example, in the entertainment industry, even comedians like Dave Chappelle, I think Chris Rock, they have yonder pouches, for example, at their entrance so that you have to lock your phone away. And that avoids a whole, universe of issues, including copyright things. But it does work. People cannot take their phones out. Could this be an option in schools, or is it too cost prohibitive for many?
It's already an option that many schools are taking up in the United States. Dayton Public Schools in the U.S. state of Ohio recently unveiled a policy where they're using yonder pouches. My understanding is that is going forward pretty well. So students put their phone in a pouch when they enter the school property. It gets locked. They can't open it until the school day is over. And that allows them to have their phone in case of emergency or for before and after school, because sometimes there's stuff about coordinating rides with their parents or other caretakers. And so a lot of parents want them to have the phone, and a lot of students want to have it for security reasons. They want to have it on them, but it doesn't present that kind of distraction in the classroom.
I mean, Rachel, what kind of methods would you be a fan of, or are you a fan of as a teacher yourself?
Well, I suppose our model is quite unique in that we're asking parents in our area, Greystones here, not to purchase a smartphone for their children at all until secondary. And it's important to say it's a voluntary code that we're asking parents to sign up to. And I think having it being voluntary, parents have really bought into it. And we would have 96% of the parents that have signed up to agree to wait and get a smartphone for their child in secondary school. So it's really good for us here in primary because it means there's no smartphones coming into the school at all. Again, I just want to stress we're not against technology, and I really do feel smartphones have their place and are brilliant later on for the children. But it's just at this age we feel it's better for them to wait to secondary, and there's perfectly good phones out there, child-friendly, lockdown phones, because I appreciate when kids get to 9, 10, 11, 12, they do after school, they do different sports and things in the afternoon that they need to be able to contact their parents. And I suppose by doing this model, then it means that the 8 schools, when they're in their final year in primary school, we will get some training, expert training in for the kids, and just to get them ready and just saying to them in a nice healthy way, look, you'll be getting your smartphones in secondary school, and here's some of the things that you should note before you get them. And I suppose you can speak to a 12-year-old much better than a 9-year-old, and also speaking to parents down the junior end in our schools. So parents of kids that are maybe 4 or 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, they're saying that they're already terrified of what's going on now. But if you roll it on another 5 years, where will their kids be, And I suppose it was getting younger and younger that kids were asking, and, their parents saying, we're the only one that doesn't have a smartphone. So it was getting harder for parents then to say no. So they're really relieved with this. We didn't know what way they would take to it, the parents, but they're really relieved, because I suppose for them, they felt like they didn't want to come across as the overprotective parent.
I don't know if you heard our previous interview with one of the authors of this UNESCO report, when I said it's better if the order comes from above, because to have the parents or the teachers have to enforce it on an individual basis. And we saw the one teacher, fall subject to an attack by one of the students that he took the phone away from. So yeah, I think everyone agrees it makes it easier on parents and teachers to have the order come from up top. And then. But let me go back, Adam. I want to step back with you, because was part of the problem in all of this the fact that because we had 2 years of a pandemic, whereby technology was almost the only way for kids to participate in school, to get their education, that now it almost seems like they have a right to have their cell phone in school, because that's what helped get them through 2 years of lockdowns. Is there this kind of blurring of the lines here because COVID made it feel so normal to have that technology at hand at all times?
There's no question that the COVID pandemic accelerated some of these trends and made maybe everyone's technology addictions a little bit worse. And that went for students more than anyone. We're dealing with now the kind of after effects. The schools are open and have been for a long time, but in the United States, we dealt with school shutdowns for an extended period of time. And now we're seeing in the data that this has had a really crushing effect on a lot of students, particularly students who are not doing all that well anyway. Students who are at the top of the distribution, who are achieving at a high level before the pandemic, really maintained that for the most part in the United States. But the studies that have come out have shown that there's been significant learning loss for those students who are in the middle of the distribution and the students who were already not doing very well. And a part of that is exactly because they were using their phones and using any kind of technology that they could get their hands on to try to engage with school there for those first few months of the pandemic. But then it drug on. And in the United States, we had lots of rules about, you couldn't make students put their cameras on. So a lot of students just kind of checked out for some of that time. They didn't learn much, and they did get more addicted to their devices. And so you're absolutely right that in the context of the pandemic, this is even a more significant issue.
Right. So we're kind of having to retrain young people that it's class time is the time that we need to focus strictly on learning. That you don't have school, you don't have your phone, you're not messaging, you're not on social media when you are there to learn. And that these distractions actually do cost students in the end. I think they have a hard time understanding that. So Rachel, let me ask you then, if cell phones are not banned, and this goes forward, and students do have them in class regularly, and they're able to engage particularly in social media while being taught, what happens?
I think it would be very challenging if smartphones were allowed into the classroom. I really do. I think it would put a lot of pressure on children themselves, particularly if some parents are holding back and not getting their child a smartphone. You know, if there's only a couple in the class that don't have smartphones, that's going to put a lot of peer pressure on them and feeling different. As you clearly said there as well, there's a huge distraction there. I think that, you know, children can get really distracted throughout the day by having that. I know I was reading in the UNESCO report there that after getting a notification on the phone that it can take up to 20 minutes for children to kick back into action, you know, with their learning. So that would be a worry. But also, as you were saying about videoing each other throughout the day or videoing their teachers, you know, there's so many distractions. And also to note as well the social interaction, you know, that we really want children to be living in the moment and not to be, you know, videoing the moment or trying to capture the moment, you know, on their phones.
Right.
So
okay.
I suppose even, yeah.
No, Rachel, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both of you so much for being with me, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.